Now, every now and then, people are going to make claims about the unreliability of the contents of what is contained in the Old Testament. But before we get into that, what I want to do is I want to show you what a forged book looks like, so we actually have something to show how reliable the Old Testament actually is. So take this. So this is allegedly the Gospel of Barnabas. This was spread around by a Turkish newspaper in 2015. The book they had a picture of that was discovered was not the Gospel of Barnabas. It's something else in Syriac. But the Gospel of Barnabas is a document that's been floating around for a while, and it claims that Jesus was rescued from the crucifixion and was replaced by Judas on the cross. It claims that Paul corrupted Christianity. It has Jesus predicting the arrival of Muhammad 9 times, and it rejects the idea of the Trinity. It's also demonstratively a medieval forgery. Well, how do we know that? Well, there's a few things. So at one part of the book, it says that Jesus is the Christ, but he's not the Messiah. That is a silly claim, because anybody who understands Hebrew and Greek will realize that Christ is just the Greek word for Messiah. The person writing this does not understand how the original languages fit together. So saying Jesus is the Christ but not the Messiah makes no sense. Christ is Messiah, Messiah is Christ. It also describes wine as being stored in barrels. Now, at the time of Jesus, in the ancient world, wherever you are, wine is not stored in barrels. It's stored in large jugs. A detail the biblical account gets right, but the Gospel of Barnabas gets wrong. However, in medieval Europe, wine would be stored in barrels. It says the word Pharisee means God seeker. The word Pharisee does not mean God seeker, it means separate. Again, the person writing this does not understand the original languages. It says that Nazareth is south of Capernaum, so it has a detail where Jesus gets off a boat in Nazareth and then walks from there to Capernaum. In reality, Nazareth is not by the sea, as any of my Palestinian listeners well know. Capernaum is by the sea. So actually, Jesus would have to get off the boat in Capernaum and then walk north to Nazareth. It also thinks that Tyre is near the River Jordan and that Nineveh is near the Mediterranean. Now, if you look on Google Maps, sure, Tyre might be near to the River Jordan, relatively speaking. However, Nineveh is nowhere near the Mediterranean. It's 400 miles away. Now, myself and almost every other Christian assumes that Nineveh is by the coast, because in the story of Jonah, it says that a whale swallows Jonah, or a great fish swallows Jonah while he's on the Mediterranean, vomits him up on the beach, and then he goes to Nineveh. And what we assume in our mind is he gets up groggy from the beach and sees Nineveh right there and just kind of walks a few hundred feet towards it. But the Bible never says Nineveh is near the coast. It just says after Jonah was vomited up by the fish, he then went to Nineveh. That would, of course, be a weeks-long journey at that time. But it's easy to understand how the writer of the Gospel of Barnabas would make that mistake, because everybody makes that mistake unless they look at a map first. And the final nail in the coffin here is it describes something called the Jubilee, when all prisoners are released and debts are forgiven, as happening every 100 years. But at the time of Jesus, the Jewish Jubilee in the Bible is every 50 years. However, in 1300, Pope Boniface VIII proclaimed a Christian Jubilee every 100 years. So a Jew living at the time of Jesus would think a Jubilee is every 50 years, but a medieval forger living in France or Spain or Italy would think that the Jubilee is every 100 years. All these details demonstrate that this book is not written by somebody who was there at the time of Jesus, but is somebody writing from medieval Europe. However, the Old Testament consistently understands the time and place it claims to be written in. So again, it gets things like how wine is stored right. It gets how grain is processed right. It gets crop cycles and farming tools and things like that correct. It clearly understands the actual geography of the ancient Near East and how long it takes to get places in the ancient Near East. Almost as if it's written by somebody who was actually there and understood the time and place it was written in. It understands the fauna and the animal life that exists at the time and location it's writing about. Like there's lions and there's jackals and there's the right types of birds, the right types of insects, things that a medieval forger would not know, but somebody living at the time and place would know. This is clearly written by somebody who's familiar with the geography, and it has been consistently vindicated against charges of historical error. A few examples of this. In the Torah, there's a man named Balaam, son of Beor, who comes to oppose the Israelites. And there's actually an inscription in Jordan from around the time of Numbers and Deuteronomy being written that says, this is the inscription of Balaam, son of Beor. He was a divine seer. And he also seemed to have invented writing things in red to make an emphasis of them as well. This can be found in the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Jordan. You can go see this for yourself in a museum. There's something called the Tel Dan Stele. It mentions Ben-Hadad, king of Syria. It mentions the deaths of King Jehoram, son of Ahab of Israel, and of Ahaz, son of Jehoram of the house of David. It mentions the death of 70 kings. It mentions that Jehu is now the ruler of Israel. And all of the details written here align with the account as presented in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, showing that this is real history in the Bible, not something that people made up later. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III in Iraq depicts Jehu of the house of Omri bowing down to Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. Now, these details are not recorded in the Bible, but the existence of Jehu, the existence of Omri are. And this is demonstrating, this is talking about the real location that it's in and using correct names for people who are in the area. This is not written later. Throughout history, our old friends, the liberal German scholars, have made several claims about the lack of reliability of the Bible. So, charge one. There's a character called King Belshazzar in the book of Daniel, who in the 1700s, the German scholars said that he did not exist and was simply made up for the sake of narrative, and no such figure ever existed, because there was no record of him ever existing. But in 1854, we discovered something called the Nabonidus cylinder, which confirms that Belshazzar existed and was second in command to Nabonidus, and that actually explains something from the book of Daniel. Before Belshazzar, every time Daniel did something amazing, he was granted rank of second person in all the kingdom. When he helps Belshazzar, he makes him third in all the kingdom. Well, why? Because Belshazzar himself was only second in the kingdom because he was the regent of King Nabonidus. So Belshazzar was a real historical figure. We know that he was in Babylon and he was there when it fell to the Persians, just as the Bible said. The truthfulness of the book of Daniel was vindicated. Charge 2, and this is a really fun one. It used to be said by the liberal German scholars that the Hittites did not exist and were merely made up by the writer of Genesis, because the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, they made no reference to the Hittites. And how could a whole empire exist and have been forgotten by those that come later? But now we've actually dug up entire Hittite cities that you can go and visit. There's artifacts, there's writing. They've found references to the Hittites in Egyptian literature. But here's the fun part. If the Jews made up the Tanakh in Babylon, if they made up Genesis in Babylon, well, the Babylonians didn't know about the Hittites. So if it was made up in Babylon, they couldn't have referred to the Hittites because nobody knew they existed anymore. This is a demonstration that the writer of Genesis was actually contemporaneous to when the Hittites were in living memory. Charge 3. Camels weren't domesticated until 1000 BC, and the Bible describes them being domesticated by Abraham in 1800 BC and being used as war mounts in Judges in 1600 BC. Muslim friends, the Qur'an tells of Abraham having camels as well, so we're both on the hook for this one. However, this assertion is based on where camel bones are found in archaeological digs, and around the Sinai Peninsula they don't find their bones going back before 1000 BC. However, there's art in Syria from 1800 BC which shows two people riding a camel. There's a camel with a bridle in the Mesopotamian Museum from 2000 BC. There's a petroglyph in Arabia from 1500 BC, and there's a petroglyph in Egypt from 2200 BC. There's still people that will tell you there are there's no evidence of camels being domesticated by 1000 BC. It's just simply not true. Didn't take that much research to find actual depictions of camels from the time. People have been using camels for a long time, and finding no bones in an archaeological dig means absolutely nothing for the domestication of camels. The Bible is reliable when it talks about this.